Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and you are here walking with Kierkegaard, getting lost, finding faith with Aaron Simmons. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing great. Can't wait to go for a walk with you today, Tripp.
Well, hopefully it's metaphorical because recording videos is really difficult if you're actually walking. I thought about saying, hey, shouldn't we try that? And then I realized it would be an experiment.
So when COVID has been going on with my students, I used to go on these walks with them. We called them lake laps because Furman University has this awesome lake right there on campus. And so because of COVID, obviously being around each other has been harder. And so I've done virtual lake laps with them where they'll call me and say, hey, will you go for a walk? It's like, heck yeah, give me a minute. And I'll pull Zoom up on my phone and I'll walk around my neighborhood. They'll go for a walk around the lake. And so we've been trying to facilitate it. It works good until the signal drops out for like 300 yards on the other side of the lake. So
it happens. It happens.
Yeah. But glad to be with you, man. Looking forward to this class and thinking about Kierkegaard with you and everybody else who's joining in with us.
Yeah. So a few kind of words up front. Each week there are readings, particular readings of Kierkegaard that we'll end up digging into. Those are available on the resource page. Ooh, a resource page, you say? Well, that is in every email you'll ever get from me about this class. And some of you won't notice it, won't remember it, and will email me, and I will cut and paste the paragraph about the resource page and send it to you like it was a syllabus. So as there's a resource page, there's a password on it. Password is Lessing in all caps. And we might talk about his ditch later, but that's why it's there. On the resource page, you get the outline of the class. And after each of these sessions, like the one you're experiencing right now, tomorrow morning, the video of this will be there and a link to the MP3. So you can download the MP3, listen to it. You can watch the video, or you could be in the Facebook group and watch video. All different ways of experiencing each session. That is, so some people will join live in the stream. Some will listen later. Some will start out joining live, get behind, not want to watch the video until they've read the reading. Some people like reading after they watch. It's all whatever works best for you. The resources are there. They'll stay up for at least 6 months after the class, so you can go at whatever pace you want. You might get done with this and say, Tripp didn't ruin Aaron's brilliance. Maybe I want to have my friend read some of this with me and watch the videos. You can do that. So resource page. Second one, questions. You can respond to any email I send you with questions. Just put them in there. And then throughout the class, when we do Q&A sessions, or maybe at the end of one of the main sessions, we can tackle questions. Ideally, they might be in some way related to Kierkegaard, but maybe not. Maybe you want Aaron and I to discuss our love for 90s music. That might be, I don't know. Fishing. We could discuss fishing. There's a whole host of things, but ideally Kierkegaard related. And if they're not, we'll have to come up with a way they're Kierkegaard related in said answering. So you can respond to those emails and get your questions. Also, first session, always a good time to invite a friend, invite people. Then you have other people to discuss it with. that are like in your real life, especially if they're that like, vaccinated friend you could go have a drink with and talk about it in a safe way. I don't want a Kierkegaard gathering to be a super spreader event unless it's spreading uncomfortability with one's finitude. That's probably like a high quality Kierkegaard gathering. The last thing I'll say is Aaron is a Kierkegaard scholar, published all sorts of things on Kierkegaard. And then I said, look, we're going to have like over 1,000 people reading Kierkegaard with us. You cannot go into, let me show you my super nerd skills and make us all fall asleep with references to who his neighbor was at a particular time, or how a translation of this one word at this one time leads this one person to say this. No, so he's going to have to be bracketing all the extensive super nerdiness. If you want it, you got to put that in a question. If you want a hot take on something nerdy, then I'll be like, Aaron, answer this question. But otherwise, our goal in this class is to encounter Kierkegaard. We're going to walk with Kierkegaard. We want the kind of pulsating energy of Kierkegaard's thought to provoke us to take our own lives, our own faith, our own world, our own challenges more seriously. So that's kind of the goal. That's all the intro things I think I'd need to say about it. But do you have advice, Aaron, like kicking this off, about how you'd want to frame the task? Because it's yes, it's academic and intellectual. Yes, it's about living. But how would you kind of introduce getting to know Kierkegaard or meeting him again if people have encountered him before?
Yeah, no, well, you've done such a good job. I'm ready to run a marathon or walk up a mountain with you, man. I think the thing I would tell people is it's a complicated task as a professor to always be speaking to a variety of audiences in a room of 25 or 30 college students, right? Because you've got the people who just had intro to philosophy, enjoyed it, and want to take something else. And so now they're in your advanced seminar on varieties of realism. But then you've also got the students who've taken 8, 9, 12 different philosophy courses, already accepted to, whereverville amazing university for graduate programs, and they're all in the same space. So as hard as it is to navigate that, when you're talking to, thousands of people who you can't see, who you don't know their backgrounds, their specific contexts, their embodied histories, the struggles they're bringing with them, the hopes that they're bringing with them to the text, it's super hard to be able to meet all of them at the same time. And so we're going to need to depend on their questions to help us shape where it is that we're going in some of this conversation, because their questions, like I tell my students, their questions are what allow me to make the responses specific to them, right? So our conversation, we'll do our best to hit sort of a range of things, never get too technical in a way that's going to lose people who don't have a great background in Kierkegaard, existentialism. You don't have to read Danish to hang out with us in this course, though it's probably awesome if you do. But at the same time, we'll try to make it of interest and with some provocative moments that maybe apply Kierkegaard's work, his life and his legacy to specific spaces where we are now that maybe are even productive and encouraging for Kierkegaard scholars who are wrestling with how do we make Kierkegaard, this person who speaks in our academic journals, speak to our lives. And part of what's so cool about reading Kierkegaard and talking about Kierkegaard is his whole philosophy was opposed to stifling thinking and living in the name of, we might say, precision, right? So he's not saying be sloppy, but he is saying, let's have some fun. Let's see where we end up. Let's wrestle with living as we live through it. So I'm stoked about the class. I can't wait to hear the questions people do submit. And I also can't wait to learn more about Kierkegaard by thinking about him with you.
So maybe it'd be good to say a bit about the Thoreau reference, right? Walking with and getting lost. Before we jump in the intro and getting to meet Kierkegaard for the first time, why use the Thoreau image of taking a walk with and getting lost with as invitation to spend time with a philosopher?
Yeah. Well, so Thoreau has this little essay called Walking. And in there, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically makes the claim, you can't go for a walk unless you're willing to get lost, right? And the idea here is, it's one thing if we know where we're headed and we're just going from point A to point B. Point B is the goal. We get to point B and we engage in whatever activity point B makes possible. But walking's different. He in fact, does some etymology with the idea of sauntering, which again would be super cool if we somehow had like, a crane shot or drone footage of you and I walking so we could saunter in front of the drone, right? And sauntering is so badass because he says sauntering, right? It conveys the sense of slowness, of the way you're walking becomes as important as where you're trying to go, right? But it's also sauntering, he says, comes from the idea of santerre, or the holy landers, right? Those who recognize that being invested in where makes you more interested and connected to why and how. And so Kierkegaard makes this great distinction between what and how, and really comes down strong on the how side of things. So for me, going for a walk with Kierkegaard is realizing that we're not simply trying to learn 7 bullet points from this lecture that I've got connected in a PowerPoint slide with awesome, graphics. It's about saying, hey, let's see where we end up, right? And if we're not willing to get lost, if we're not willing to expose ourselves to objections and claims and views that may wreck us, right? Like Kierkegaard, though this is sacrilege to say, he's kind of like the Miley Cyrus in philosophy, right? He's like the wrecking ball coming in. Hopefully he's not naked on top of it. That probably wouldn't be great. He's probably got a face for radio or something. But the idea is Kierkegaard and philosophy in general should be a wrecking ball for what it looks like to rest easy in complacency, right? Kierkegaard challenges the obviousness of what we take for granted as he invites us to try on different ways of moving in the world. And I think, in fact, part of his use of pseudonyms is a walking example, right? I call it the Everlast hermeneutic. You remember Everlast back from, was it House of Pain, right? And then he put out his Whitey Ford Sings the Blues album, where it's got the, what it's like, because you won't know what it's like unless you walk a mile in their shoes. Well, that Everlast hermeneutic is the idea of walking with. Kierkegaard tries on different pseudonyms to walk as different people with different commitments and see where it ends up, where it takes him.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, like when he says he takes on pseudonyms, if you're new to Kierkegaard, it means like your reading for next week are 2 different people. Like the authors, the pseudonymous authors, Kierkegaard writes in the voice of other people.
And that walking, right? He's not just, hey, let's just see if I hide behind. He's saying, no. What if I really held the views and lived inside a different way of making sense of the world? And then he goes for a walk. And he writes ridiculously long books that probably could have benefited from an editor, in that perspective. So Thoreau seems to just capture what we're going to try to do, right? You can't go for a walk unless you're willing to be at stake. So I often think we don't read to figure out what the thinker is saying. We do that, but we also read to go to the thinker's encounter. And this is something that Martin Heidegger, in fact, suggests. When we go to a thinker's encounter, what we're doing is actually opening ourselves to be put in question by a text, not simply to raise the questions of the text.
Yeah.
And you know what? Walking with my 12-year-old son, we've been, hiking together since he was a little teeny guy. There is nothing more exciting than going for a walk with a little kid, because everything's freaking magic. Everything is miracles. Everything is glorious. And yet everything is also scary, right? So that's the goal of this class.
Mhm.
Let's go for a walk, find what is just stunning about life and Kierkegaard's authorship, and also what's really frightening about it. And then
Mhm.
figure out how then are we going to go forward and find ourselves in light of that walk together.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, for those that didn't see the preview podcast, you should definitely go check that out. You'll see some of the big themes and stuff that are going to come up throughout the class. But today, the reading is based on early journals of Kierkegaard's life. And so before we get into digging those texts, Aaron's going to kick things off with some, big ideas, themes, and such as for background, especially for those of you that took the risk to sign up to take an online reading group of a 19th century philosopher. So with that, I'm going to let Aaron take it away and introduce us to the first stage of the walk.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Tripp. And to everybody, we're so excited to be with you. And it is always exciting to read Kierkegaard with people reading Kierkegaard for the first time. And so those of you who are old hats at this and can list off the different pseudonyms and talk about his broken engagement and are ready to, navigate the later attack on Christendom, hold your horses. We're going to get there. But for those of you who are new to this thinker, who may have signed up just because, you love Tripp's work and this looked cool, or you've heard this name floating around and wanted to figure out what's going on. Soren Kierkegaard is a Danish thinker born in 1813, dies in 1855. So he only lives 42 years, which of course is something that entirely freaks me out since I'm 44. And so it always gives me pause when I realize like how much this guy was able to get done and how good his work was. I always feel like I got to step my game up. So he's born in 1813. His father had gotten fairly wealthy, doing a variety of different things, and so was fairly well off. Kierkegaard's mother was actually his father's second wife. She was actually the maid of Kierkegaard's father's first wife. And they had, Kierkegaard's father basically has 7 kids. Most of them end up dying very young. Kierkegaard lived in a house that was defined by very, very severe religiosity. His father had early in his life cursed God, standing on a Jylland, heath out in the, rural areas, basically had, cursed God because of his frustrations with the world, and felt like that his family had been cursed as a result, which of course allowed him to make sense of or explain lots of, his children's death, the death of his wife, etc. Well, Kierkegaard grows up in this home, and he was, very aware, very cognizant of the heaviness of his house. And so even as a young kid, his melancholic moods would show up. He describes his melancholy quite intensely in some of his later journals and says this goes back to his youth. Well, then, as kids do, right? They go off to college, rebel a little bit against their upbringing. And he goes off to college and, has a fine old time. He didn't necessarily go to the #1 party school, in the world, but it seemed like he partied a little bit. Kierkegaard had some good times in college. But he also was kind of aimless. He was floundering around. He studied everything from literature to law to philosophy to the sciences. In fact, in the journal entries we're going to look at today, he talks about kind of why he ended up going in the direction he did instead of all these other interests that he had and developed while he was there in college. He also ends up getting engaged to a young woman named Regina Olsen, and his relation with her is intense and deep and abiding. But he gets engaged to her, and he says the next day realizes that this, in fact, is not going to work. Like it was an almost immediate response to her saying yes, that he realizes there's no way he can go through with this. And it goes back in some ways to some of this intense religious our words would be fundamentalism of his father. He basically thought he could only do one thing. He could either devote his life to Regina, or he could devote his life to the work and writing that he thought God was calling him to. And he ends up breaking his engagement, which was quite a scandal. In those days, this was way bigger deal than what we now would think of, or, now we've got people giving promise rings to eventually get engaged when they then are engaged to be engaged, right? It's just no big deal, whatever. Engagements last forever. Well, in his context, this was like a significant, severe, socially powerful moment. So when he breaks his engagement, it not only marks his life forever, but it also wrecks Regina. I mean, she ends up in depression and all kinds of illness for a while, and then comes out of it, eventually remarries or marries another man. That man ends up going off to what were called the West Indies. We now call the Virgin Islands. He goes to St. Croix, actually, and becomes the governor there. And Kierkegaard stays in love with Regina to such an extent that he actually, upon death, leaves his whole literary estate to her. Everything goes to her. He devotes many books to her in all kinds of cryptic ways. It's an obsession that never quite leaves him. So engagement's broken. He's now sort of reinvested in theology as a way forward, and philosophy. His whole life, he said that really all he ever wanted to do was be married and be a country rural pastor. Like, that's what he really wanted from his life. And in some ways, he kind of acts like it just wasn't in the cards, that what he calls providence didn't have that as his path. His walk took him in a different direction. And so he ends up finishing his degree, writes a dissertation actually on Socratic irony as a critique of what was going on in Romantic irony of the day. And fairly, shortly thereafter, he experiences a variety of things. So lots of his siblings have died. His first real publication was actually called Papers from One Still Living, like a morbid title, if there ever was one. And it's a critique of Hans Christian Andersen, actually. And so this was all going on in what's sometimes called Golden Age Denmark, which is where we had the sort of flourishing and flowering of Danish culture happening in physics and literature, and then Kierkegaard in philosophy and theology. There was a lot going on just in the nation. You had the Moravian pietists had begun to really get traction in the countryside and the rural areas. Copenhagen was the center of Danish cultural life. Kierkegaard spent his entire life in Copenhagen. In fact, most of his life was spent within 1 kilometer of city center. He did take several trips to Berlin to go hear lectures by Schelling, talk about Hegel and idealism. Took a trip to Sweden, but didn't do a lot of travel. He lived a life that looked more like Immanuel Kant, who spent his whole life in 1 little square mile of Königsberg, Germany. So Kierkegaard is now finishing his degrees. He's kind of finding himself, discovering sort of, where he is and why it matters. And then something important happens. His father dies. And when his father dies, of course, it really kind of ruptures his sense that everything was okay. And he got just fully invested in the idea that he has got to be on mission, on purpose. And this then creates in him what we would now describe as a kind of radical religious conversion experience, this kind of moment where God now and his Christianity went from being, kind of present again, just kind of as he's reconciling with his dad and kind of getting out of college and all this. But now it becomes why he's on earth. This is who he is and why he is and everything that matters. And so then in 1843, he basically begins producing works, and boy, they come at a clip. I mean, dude's doing, 2-3 books a year. On top of this, volumes and volumes of journals, which are just amazing. He's writing under pseudonyms, but he's also, while he's writing under pseudonyms, he's also publishing devotional literature. He calls them the upbuilding discourses under his own name. It's a staggering output. The sheer amount is overwhelming, but the quality, the intensity, the rigor is also just staggering, because he has a sense of an authorship. We now live in an age where authorship doesn't matter as much, right? It's, can you publish 3 articles by tenure in the right journals and you're good. Kierkegaard's approach was never to publish this or that article, because it wasn't done in order to gain some sort of status. When his father died, he was left with a pretty significant amount of money, which allowed him to not have to worry about, working for a living. And instead, he wrote and he wrote and he wrote some more. He had multiple personal assistants and secretaries who would help copy edit and read drafts and things. And meanwhile, his brother, Peter, was a pastor in the Danish Lutheran Church. And so you had Kierkegaard, this budding, emerging voice in theology and philosophy. His brother was sort of part of the established church that Kierkegaard was early on already kind of critical of, because he saw it as abandoning the real core and fiber of Christian life. And so he sees his whole authorship as, what he says, engaging the task of becoming a Christian and trying to figure out what that means. And he says that in order to do this, he's got to bring Christianity back to Christendom. And by Christendom, he means this establishment. The Danish culture was such that you would get baptized as an infant, and it baptized you not only into salvation and the church, but into Danish citizenship. So what it meant to be a Christian just meant to be a citizen. And Kierkegaard, coming out of this sort of 3-pronged influence. On the one hand, he's got idealism, which he inherits lots from, but also reacts very critically against, because idealism in general was about objectivity, about structures of existence, about the way in which we would transcend our individuality, our personality, to get to what Kant will call the transcendental unity of apperception, or the great rational thing that made us who we were, but not as singular selves, but as instances of something like rational existence. Hegel emerges and in 1807 publishes Phenomenology of Spirit, where everything was geared toward overcoming your subjectivity in the attempt to merge so far as possible into the objective working of what he calls absolute spirit. And what then results from this for Kant is this idea of moralitate, or the idea that life was defined by understanding rational codes by which all people then could eliminate their individuality by doing things the right way in response to reason's demands. Hegel, alternatively, says, no. It's not this sort of rational conception. It's what he called Sittlichkeit, or it's about social mores and customs that are historically embodied in the world. But those historical mores and customs are a way of overcoming your individuality to become part of a community, part of a culture, part of a state. That's where you fully embody spirit, is you get out of yourself into this social thing. So you become a role. You become the father, the mother, the priest, the civil servant, the citizen. So Christianity, on Kant's model, Kierkegaard thought reduced to reason, which lost the passion of faith. Christianity on Hegel's model reduced to playing a social role, which lost the radical subjectivity of personal relationship. So for Kierkegaard, his fight against this Christendom idea was also a struggle with this idealist narrative that had been handed over. But it was also an appropriation of and critique of Romanticism, which of course was saying, yay emotion, yay passion, radical individual experience. But that also had given rise to what Kierkegaard took to be an asceticism that was actually dangerous, where we were just aesthetes running around seeking pleasure after pleasure, fleeting goods, just wanting the experience without the depth of relation. So he's got idealism, romanticism, and then in the background also this pietistic history that he had been raised in and appropriated. And he clung to much of that in response to this established kind of elitist model of respectable Christianity there in the cities. So that's kind of where Kierkegaard found himself. And then he engages in this authorship. And again, there's two authorships, the pseudonymous authorship, which are where we get philosophy, some theology, literary works. I mean, he's really doing all kinds of things. And then this signed or upbuilding or confessional or devotional authorship. And he would publish them simultaneously. Many times he'd publish on the same day a pseudonymous work with a signed work as well. So he goes forward, he writes an enormous amount over the next 5, 6, 7 years. When we get to 1848, 1849, of course, there's the Danish political upheaval as a result of the, political revolutions going on all over Europe. It goes to a democracy almost overnight. It radically changes its makeup and its sort of feel of what it's doing. It creates also a really interesting shift in Kierkegaard's focus. And so Kierkegaard, towards the end of this writing, so 47, 48, etc., he's starting to write in this mode of explicitly engaging in this task of Christian selfhood and this idea of what it means to be a Christian. He writes several books under the pseudonym Anticlimacus, which he uses as his ideal Christian, who is a better Christian than Kierkegaard could ever be, because Kierkegaard is becoming rather than already achieved it. And then, for several years, it looks as if Kierkegaard has kind of finished his task. He wrote a little essay called My Point of View on My Work as an Author, and sort of summarizes, lots of what's going on and what he's been doing and what his task had been from the beginning. He writes a little thing called A Glance at Danish Literature, which is technically just a sort of review essay of all his own work, and sort of, comes out as the author as if anybody wasn't sure, but they all, of course, knew. And then he sort of, gets quiet in his mind, still journaling, still writing, but just not publishing as much. And then a couple things happen. One, his father's preacher, Bishop Münster, actually dies. When Bishop Münster dies, Kierkegaard sort of feels freed to now be more critically engaged, because he had sort of, out of respect to his father, not swung with, body blows against the church, still represented by this man who had been so significant to his father. And the person who comes in and takes over after Münster, named Martensen, takes over and sort of doubles down on this Hegelian approach to Christian life, where it was about your role, about this objectivity, about sort of, state power and structure. And in this move, Kierkegaard just sort of can't stand it anymore, and he engages in what's called the attack on Christendom. And in the attack on Christendom, he kind of makes it personal, right? He goes after these leaders and tries to show that established Christianity has abandoned what Christianity is all about, as expressed in Jesus's invitation to love the widow, the orphan, the stranger, to love your neighbor as yourself. So we get this attack, and then it really gets ratcheted up right at the end of his life with essays that were so polemical as to be almost, misanthropic at times. I mean, he really, some people read it as he, was sort of becoming unstable. Others read it as the necessary consequence of what he had been doing for his whole authorship, that he just finally took the masks off and really said what he had wanted to say, full-throated, without having to have the kind of pretext and pretense to sort of make it hidden. Well, in 1855, having engaged in this rather visceral and all-consuming attack on Christendom, where Kierkegaard outlines what he takes to be, Christianity as Jesus modeled it, rather than Christianity as the state or the powerful or the elite had taught it, he's walking in the street and collapses. What gets reported as paralysis of the legs, ends up in the hospital for a few weeks and then dies. Now, there's a lot of speculation about, what really happened and what were the illnesses and all of this, and the speculations about kind of what had affected Kierkegaard range from arguments about syphilis to epilepsy to, just all kinds of different suggestions about what happened. But nonetheless, he dies. And as you can imagine, somebody who's got a brother who's a well-established, well-known preacher in the Danish church, and somebody who had spent most of his adult life critiquing that church, there's a debate. Well, now what do we do with him? What do we do with his thought? What do we do with his body? What do we do for his, funeral? Well, the powers that be won out, and they decided to have a church funeral there at the cathedral in Copenhagen. And as I think is so fitting for Kierkegaard's strange, crazy, engaging life, one of his nephews, Heinrich Lund, shows up at the funeral, and just, almost in a kind of New Testament way, you pit of vipers, right? You viperous brood kind of lecture, just reams out everyone there and says, look, you're making a mash. You're destroying everything he did. This is proving his point. You've whitewashed every critique he ever made by trying to now make sure that he's drawn back into the fold here at the end, rather than letting his critique wreck you. And the fact that he basically had, almost a riot breakout at his funeral seems entirely right for this guy, right? He is a man who spent all of his life deeply in love with someone who he couldn't be with. He spent his life writing furiously, and yet not getting a huge reception in his own time. It actually took until the existentialists of the early 20th century for Kierkegaard really to find traction. There were some early German translations, but it wasn't really until the 20th century that he found an audience. This is a man who was raised religiously and spent his whole life in the name of religion, fighting religion. This is a man who thought that ultimately the goal was to be just a country pastor, and yet spent his life in the middle of the cultural hub of his country, fighting everything that looked respectable therein. Kierkegaard is an author of The Paradox, famously, and I think his life was a performance of what it is that he talks about in his works. I find Kierkegaard compelling precisely because, in comparison to most other 19th century figures that we study, the Hegels and Marxes and stuff of the world, Kierkegaard was a pretty boring kind of guy. And yet, my goodness, as he says in Fear and Trembling, the knight of faith continually finds the sublime in the pedestrian. And I think his quasi-pedestrian life, who could have thought that it would contain such a sublime tornado of impact? His thought eventually gave rise and shaped deeply the existentialists of the 20th century, both Christian and atheistic. His thought has been referred to as, he's been referred to as the father of existentialism, which in some ways is not false. His writings engage all of the different aspects of human existence, from despair to joy, from love to resentment, from fear to anxiety and repetition of the everyday. He thinks in particular in terms of what have become known as stages of existence. But I think the better way to put it is he thinks in terms of what scholar Jamie Ferreira refers to as paradigms for how to live. And he gives us three. And famously, these are aesthetic, ethical, and religious. And these three stages are not progressions. It's not like you as a kid are aesthetic, which was true for him, and then become ethical and then become religious. They are options, right? The aesthetic represents the romantic mode, the way that we live in immediacy. We seek not relational love. We seek the experience of the burn bright, burn fast, and burn out kind of experience. The ethical is marked by the Hegelian idea of Sittlichkeit, of rational expectations to become a role in society and find yourself in the infinite and eternal significance of where you are and why you are. And then the religious is, he says, the second immediacy. It's where we come into radically singular relationship with a radically personal God. And he says that aesthetics and ethics both lead to despair, but he doesn't act as if these are things that we avoid at all times. It's instead to say that no matter how religious you are always tempted in constructive and destructive ways by the desire for immediacy and the desire for cultural esteem and social life. So this is a man who, in many ways, our society today couldn't produce, right? Because it needs somebody who was able to have the luxury not to have to go to a job, to think carefully about a lifetime of authorship with no real ability to make that authorship gain traction during his life. But everything we do now is so fast, so immediate, right? You write the book and it has you and I both have written a bunch of books, Tripp, 9 to 12 months, maybe as a sales cycle. And then it's on like the clearance bin at discountbooks.com. I mean, Kierkegaard contributed a life to his authorship. His authorship is his life. And this is why when he dies, it's fascinating. One of his other nephews comes and asks him and says, do you have anything else that needs said? And he basically says, I'm good. So he says a few things to some family members and things like this, but he lived his life with everything he had in him and spent all of it, spent all of his money, all of his energy, all of his passion. And what he leaves for us is an invitation to make the most of our finitude. And as far as I'm concerned, boy, that's something well worth the price of admission. So I hope that gives a general synopsis of kind of his life and his influences and some of the big structuring ideas in his thought. I'm happy to go into more detail if you think we need to, but that'd probably be how I'd frame generally what he's up to and kind of how it's been undertaken and taken up from there.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of it for a short life, and one that wasn't like packed full of being present at historical moments or intense travel and this kind of thing. It's still a colorful life, and at some point they're going to make a high quality movie about it.
I think it needs done. A buddy of mine actually, he has some screenwriting experience, and he and I tried to write a screenplay for Kierkegaard's The Seducer's Diary. And we tried to turn that into a movie. We thought, my God, this is going to be so good. And it turns out it was nearly impossible because what we kept realizing was it would never be understood in this Kierkegaardian sense, right? It would just look like this bizarre, misogynist temptation, kind of teen flick thing. And so we gave up. But so yes, to any of you aspiring screenwriters out there, Kierkegaard's life and also The Seducer's Diary in particular, I think are ripe for film treatment. Yeah.
I mean, I think you start with The Funeral and then you have a whole bunch of like vignettes about his like relationship with the individual people present. And
It'd be so cool.
Anyway,
Yep.
so do you want to like say a bit about where the readings for this week come from? Because I mean they're from his journals and that kind of thing, but what was he doing with his journals? So are these the kind of journals where, you know, he anticipates they'll be read at some point, or are these the ones if his parents found and read them, he'd be disappointed? You know?
Yeah, the one he's hiding in his sock drawer, along with the NWA CD or something. So Kierkegaard journaled from his early 20s for the rest of his life. The specific entries that we're looking at for today are actually, at least, as the Hongs say in their translation, they're ostensibly addressed to someone, right? Now, it's unclear at the end of the day whether, do these things get mailed? Were they really just letters, right? The fact that he'd write them in his journal and we have them in his journal, again, means that at least he seemed to be writing these in a mode or a way that would then be stabilized in this sort of, set of texts that were still in his study when he died. But basically, the way he writes journals, it does seem, and there's again a lot of scholarly debate about all of these things, and people way better than me who do stuff like the material culture of Kierkegaard's life, right? But it seems like he did mean for an awful lot of this to be published after his death. It's not just sort of self-reflective things. There's an audience, and the audience emerges. Now it changes and it morphs and it twists through the journals. But in these cases, he's writing these, to a person, and this person who's over in Brazil, and he even talks about how nice it must be there and these experiences you must be having, and signs off with almost like salutations, so stay positive, we'll see you next week, kind of a stuff. But what's so powerful about these is he's writing these 1835, right? So that means he's 22 years old. So I read these essays, these journal entries in particular, with my students all the time, because he's writing these as basically what we would now think of as a college senior, right? And a couple of things start popping out. One, maybe there are others just smarter and better than me, but I certainly would not be writing things with this level of self-reflective and awareness when I was a college senior. I was way more interested in Florida State going to the national championship that year, or when is 311 coming to town and when's their next show, right? And yet Kierkegaard at 22 years old, really, we can start to see that transition, that pivot in his life from, college party boy to reflective, invested, intense thinker who realizes that subjectivity is the game. That's the key. And so these also are fascinating because here we see at 22 years old, I would suggest almost all, if not all, almost all of the big themes that show up throughout the rest of his mature authorship. So somehow at 22, he already had a sense of the guiding vision and guiding ideas and guiding themes that would then be the well from which he drew the rest of his life. And how many of us at 22 can say that? My goodness, right? We didn't know what we were doing 3 weeks from then, much less the rest of my literary authorship and my existence has now got a direction. So that's why these are powerful. And I often read these as the best graduation speeches ever, though they'd be horrible because they're also, not exactly written in that genre, but they're so good because it's a matter of finding who we are, finding where we're going, and finding why it matters. That's what 22-year-olds are looking for. But hell, man, that's what 44-year-olds are looking for.
Yeah, we just get a lot better the older you get at denying how
Yeah.
how thin and vapid existence
David
is.
Foster Wallace has this great line somewhere where he says that the only difference between our generation now and those that preceded it is that we are just the most literate and articulate about our frustrations. Right? We're less frustrated. We just write more poetically about it. I think that's right. 44-year-olds, we are absolutely just as lost. It's just that we've got a lot more distractions now to keep us from having to wrestle with it quite so acutely.
Yeah. So there are a couple of different passages and things I think would be fun to look at. And one, like at the very beginning, he brings up tension that, runs through these, but also runs through so much of his writing. The bottom of the first page, he says, there are others who let themselves be influenced so completely by their surroundings that it never becomes clear to them in what direction they're really striving. And I think, and if you go through, there's a number of places in this where he keeps picking up on this tension where in some sense, who we are is defined by our relationships with others, be it even our concept of ourself, our neighbors, those our interlocutors, and even God. But there's always this tension as to whether or not the self that you're even transparent to yourself, or is maybe it's a kind of pseudo self, or a fake self. It's not something like deep, intensely held, chosen, determined, engaged. I don't know, like how would you put that tension going on, and what is the challenge for someone that begins to take that that is a pressing question.
Yeah. Well, so it's so interesting because what's happening here, right, is we have what we could describe this kind of existential point, which is, there are two types of people, he's saying, right? There are others who, right? But if you go back, he's already defined the other others, right? He says, this requires above all that one be allowed to grow in the soil where one really belongs. But that is not always so easy to find, right? As we all know, belonging is perhaps the hardest thing to find. Where am I and why does it matter, right? What's my purpose? This is, every college group that's devoted to finding your calling. Kierkegaard saying, yeah, you need them because it's hard to find. In this respect, there exist fortunate creatures. So we've got fortunate creatures, and then there are others, which is where you take us, right? Fortunate creatures who have such a decided inclination in a particular direction that they faithfully follow the path once it is laid out for them without ever falling prey to the thought that perhaps they ought to have followed an entirely different path. So in other words, what is he saying? There are people, right? And for me, I always think in analogies. So this is the college freshman who's coming in and you say, oh, what do you want to study? And they say, I'm going to study chemistry, and I'm going to med school, and I'm going to be a cardiologist, right? And it's like boom, boom, boom. And never once do they question that path, do they question that task or that direction or its significance. Never. And he's saying that would be great. Like, they're fortunate. Now, he's also tongue in cheek, right? Because he's recognizing we ain't so fortunate, those of us wrestling with the fact that decision is real, right? There are others then. So you've got the fortunate creatures who just, again, that chemistry pre-med major who knows everything and is on the way to it, who let themselves be influenced so completely, it never becomes clear what direction they're really striving. This is I don't really know what I want to study, but I like that professor, so we'll do that. But then, of course, they take a different professor and they switch to this other thing, and they take another professor, or they go to a Bible class and say, oh, shoot, well, I really need to do it. I've got a student from the past who I used to call Squirrel. His name was Hey Squirrel, because it was whatever way, he was just darting to wherever the nut was. Boom, boom. And so Kierkegaard's saying, look, we've got to be careful about what's motivating our lives. And that existential point is a deeply Augustinian one, right? Because our desire identifies us. It names us. It constitutes us. So we've got some who, in fact, have, notice both of these groups are equally despairing because the first group doesn't take ownership of the risk of the decision to make their life path go this direction. He says it's fortunate because they also aren't aware of that despair, right? But they're also lost. This other group, the others, they're just jumping all over the place, never having a path, never finding their footing. And unfortunately, neither of these make any sense, right? So Kierkegaard's
the explicit
here,
or the implicit, right? Like
right. Are you aware of it or are you in denial about it, right? But notice there's also this level here, which is precisely something Heidegger will pick up on and develop into the idea of das Man, or the they, the anonymous they who influence our decision-making and then constitute our identity without us ever recognizing that it's being so constituted. In both of these cases, the people who, fortunate creatures who know where they're going, do you think they knew that out of just genuine deep self-reflection? No, it's they've inherited what the they has said and they're marching, they're going. And then you've got these others who are taking in what they are saying. They're just realizing, oh, shoot, there's a bunch of theys, right? Yeah. Which is the one. And so Kierkegaard's invitation is, how do we find what it means to belong with a direction that is purposive? I sometimes define faith as risk with a direction. And that's precisely what we see him developing here. It is risk with a direction. Each of these people, each of this type of person, they're taking risk, right? And each of these type of people have a direction. It's just one knows the direction, the other doesn't. And therefore they're moving, but they're moving without intentionality as a matter of recognizing the influencing that has already shaped them. And that's existential life. That's the question of, so, the old, was it, Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, what was the song? So who, you got to worship somebody? This is that question.
You got to
who are you worshiping? Right? You got to have a God. So what's the God look like for you? Is it them or is it the other them? And Kierkegaard's trying to reveal that to us.
And I think there's a sense that even in that contrast, the contrast, both sides get problematized but in a different way, or at least they hear the problem, the way it's problematized differently, because I was a campus minister and have dealt with undergrads, and you see it in the kind of archetypal ways that you were drawing, but the same is true with each adult negotiating their vocation, right? Like you've been on this path, you were making a decision on this path, you're going to perform whatever it is you're supposed to do in this situation, or you're trying to set your own path and figure out where you're really going to go. You do the same thing with parenting. We each inherit, right? Like the world we're thrown into is so shaped by the world that our parents hand on to us. And when it comes to parenting, you're like, this is obvious the case. And then when you get married, you find out that everyone doesn't parent just like you were parented. And you have to read it. I think that there is this sense that that in that the act of decision is a task the individual has to do for themselves. And what are you doing it in relationship to? When decision is on behalf of the das Man, then is it really yours? And then the decision comes as a kind of act of differentiation, even if it's not something that the whole or the community is going to be dismissive of. Yeah, no, you're saying more articulately than the tagline that I sometimes use, and I actually had a t-shirt made that says this. It says existentialism, not just for goth kids. Right? Because that's the truth. This is for,
all living people, all existing humans. And he says, in fact, on 10, which is one of the other journal entries that we're looking at, exactly what you just said about you're going along, you're rocking, things are fine, and you hit something and it snaps, right? And now you're back in that space. He says, middle of page 10 is often when a person has concentrated on something, a minor external circumstance arises that destroys everything. As in the case of a man who, weary of life, is about to throw himself into the Thames and at the crucial moment is halted by the sting of a mosquito, right? So Kierkegaard realizes life is lived, which again sounds so trivial. It sounds like, a bro culture frat t-shirt, right? Wherever you go, there you are. Life has got to be lived. And yet Kierkegaard's saying, but man, what have we forgotten where we are? That life is a lived thing, that life is a living. The phenomenologist Michel Henry actually develops this so well by saying, look, the riddle of life, as Kierkegaard refers to it, is not something that can be answered by biologists, right? Yeah. Don't they study living things? Well, yeah, but what they mean by life is not the living of life, right? It's objectifying life as a thing of study. Kierkegaard is subjectifying the act of living as itself the condition of all study.
Yeah.
Right. And it's so cool because after he's given us these two, again, kind of archetypal options, and you're right to say, this is just all of us, he then immediately says, but this is what opens on to these questions that we see in Faust, right? It's about doubt. And it's about doubt in the sense of, unless we at some point say to ourselves, what am I doing? if we don't ask that question, is this really what I love? Is that direction in which I find myself striving a direction I want to keep moving in? Right? And he says, it's so cool, bottom of 4, such doubt can manifest itself in other spheres. In other words, all areas of our lives, these moments can show up. Even though a person may have come to terms with a few of these main issues, right? Which again, in our 40s, we've probably got a few more of those. Life offers other significant questions. Naturally, every person desires to work according to his abilities in this world, but it follows from this that he wishes to develop his abilities in a particular direction, namely in that which is best suited to him. And here's the key: as an individual. And then immediately, but which is that, right? So as soon as we realize taking a strength finders test at the career services office, though may be a good idea, it's never going to tell you your direction in a way that allows your individuality to be cognizant and present to you on purpose. The question remains. Here, he says, I am confronted with a big question mark. And he gives it, because there's lots of ways forward. Which one? Right? How do I know? And what's so cool about this is it actually anticipates an idea that Bonhoeffer, who I know a lot of your students have taken as well, the audience has been in that class. Bonhoeffer has this great line at the end of a letter to Reinhold Niebuhr, where he says, maybe I should come back to the US. Maybe I should flee Germany. Maybe I should stay. And he says, I know what I must do. And he says, I have to stay to be in solidarity with the people suffering. But he says, I cannot make this decision in security, right? I pray God forgive me if I do it wrong. Like the whole idea is Martin Luther was wrong. It's not here I stand, I can do no other. The fortunate few get to say that, but they're just not paying attention, says Kierkegaard, right? Bonhoeffer is right. We can always do otherwise. And that's what's so difficult. And we know this, when you chose to go, back to school over there in the UK, you could have done other things. When I chose to take the job at Furman, where I'm at now, I could have chose other options. And we have to somehow navigate the world, says Kierkegaard, with an eye toward where am I, whose influence is impacting my decision making, and am I able, not in some sort of decisionistic, hey, whatever, Emerson has that right whim above the lintels of the doorpost, right? Kierkegaard's not saying that. This is not about whim. This is about the depth of calling lived out subjectively as a narrative. Mm-hmm. What will your story then say? Recently, you did a class with Brian McLaren, his early book, The Story We Find Ourselves In. Mm-hmm. That is so Kierkegaardian. And then Kierkegaard says, yeah, you're in a story that you didn't start writing, but guess what? Now you've got the pen. Mm-hmm. What's the end of it gonna look like? What do you now do for the chapters that are just blank pages? Well, and that is terrifying to us.
Well, and I think that part of the task of life is realizing that living is terrifying, right? So the kind of either doing what was handed to you and pretend that it's your deepest desire, or the fluctuating between options to avoid having to settle anywhere, like those are all techniques of avoiding that you are responsible for what you do with the little bit of freedom and the little bit of time you have. And so how much of your life is going to be lived with that type of intensity or that type of passion? And what's cool, this is one of the things I liked about Kierkegaard, is he has a kind of a baseball vibe about it, right? Like you fail 70% of the time and you're an all-star. And I think that a lot of times, especially if you come from a religious context, the idea of perfection or the idea of a good faith, this thing feels really threatening. But there's something beautiful about realizing that this is really, really hard. And so why don't you give yourself to it and open yourself up to that risk of seeking to live intentionally, giving yourself or having deep passion for life, love, beauty, justice, and such.
Yeah, you will, using your metaphor, you will either hit every ball that you don't go to the plate to try to swing at, or you will strike out at every batting attempt that you don't go to the plate. It's a matter of recognizing, but your stats, both directions are going to be zero, right? But it's safe because how do we narrate it, right? Oh man, if I had been, it's the Sunday morning quarterbacking. Since I hate NFL, I always watch football on Saturdays. It's your couch quarterbacking, right? You're like, I should have done this. You're watching the baseball games. My father-in-law is a big baseball fan, loves the Tampa Bay Rays, and we were recently watching baseball together. And I mean, he and I, the whole night, all we did was just like, all these stupid coaches, they should have done this thing or this thing, right? Because our batting average is 1,000, man. Like every decision we've ever made worked out because there was no consequence because I'm not actually calling in the receiver. Or you can be I'm just so despairing, I can't do anything. What am I up to? Because every decision would be the wrong one. And so you never make them. Those are mirror images of people unwilling to get in the game. Right now, my father-in-law, to his credit, used to be a college baseball player and stuff. So for him, he got in the game, right? I never played baseball past Little League, but yet, boy, I sure know what that coach who's done this for however many decades should do, right? And it's the realization that, ultimately freedom is real. And it's important, something that is always a caveat worth saying whenever I make these claims. There are different kinds of freedom. The kind of freedom Kierkegaard's talking about looks more like the kind of freedom that Jean-Paul Sartre says we are condemned into, right? We are condemned to be free, says Sartre. So what he's not saying is, freedom is something that is purely a result of sociopolitical realities and, overcoming historical marginalization, et cetera. So while fully granting, and it's something Kierkegaard doesn't do enough to think through, fully granting the reality that different types of bodies that have inherited privilege are freer than others to make certain kinds of decisions in the world. That's not what Kierkegaard's ultimately talking about. Kierkegaard, like Sartre and like all the existentialists, are talking about the freedom to decide what will matter to you as a means of self-definition, right? Now, freedom is real in that sense, but so are the consequences, right? So there's never a time where the one doesn't involve the other. Just yesterday, I was camping with my son and my nephew, and my nephew is 7, turning 8. My son is just turned 12. So they're in the backseat of my truck, and we're up in the mountains. And man, it just gets loud. And so I'm talking to, my sister's partner, and we look like, hey, they're back there with empty water bottles. I mean, just beating the tar out of each other, right? And on the one hand, I was like, man, it looks fun. On the other hand, it's like, probably should say, like, guys, be careful. Somebody's probably going to get hurt. Mm-hmm. And they keep beating. And I said, all right, be aware, like, this is what tends to happen. Somebody's going to get hurt. Then the other person's going to get mad. And because they're mad, then you're going to not like each other for probably about an hour. And it's going to make the camping trip really frustrating. What if we just didn't go down that road, guys? Right. And my, sister's partner turns, he's like, hey, it's like, the consequences now, make good choices, right? Not 30 seconds later, Tripp, boom. Ah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Because the water bottles had now advanced to sticks that they had found last place we were walking. So they're now beating each other with sticks. Of course, one of them gets hurt. The other one's now, I'm so sorry. It wasn't my fault. I didn't mean to. The point was like, and we're just looking like, how are you surprised by that? This is what we told you, but you've got to understand that you had the freedom to live into this or to change course, right? And that's the reality. Is Kierkegaard is recognizing that the big question mark in the singular, the big question mark is precisely which way should I go, right? And the which way should I go is for Kierkegaard. And this is important in a world defined by STEM priorities and business logics and consumer models of personal value. The which way should I go is not a question exclusively anchored in a question about career. Mm-hmm. It's a question about identity. Who will you be? Who will you be? And the only way to answer the question of who will you be is to take up the task of who am I becoming? Kierkegaard's authorship, I would suggest, can be summarized in the simple phrase, you are who you are becoming. Mm-hmm. You are who you are becoming. A quote my mom used to tell me when I was a kid that she got, if I'm not mistaken, from a man named Paul Kahn in a chapel service at Lee University years and years and years ago. And somehow it had morphed down to me. And then when I hit Kierkegaard, it was like, I get it now. Who I am now is who I'm becoming, because I have to today make the choices to become something and someone differently. And if I don't make that choice now and take the risk that it doesn't work, I'll never become the person I wish I were. I'll only become the person that I am. And am I okay with that? Mm-hmm. That's a scary, scary, scary thought. At 18, at 22, and at 40. Am I okay with the person I am now? Because that's who I'm also becoming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are 3 places I want to make sure we talk about before we run out of time. So I'll read the quote and ask some vague question. But the first one is on the top of page 8. Kierkegaard says, what I really need is to get clear about what I am to do, not what I must know, except insofar as knowledge must precede every act. What matters is to find my purpose, to see what it really is that God wills that I should do. The crucial thing is to find a truth that is truth for me, to find the idea for which I'm willing to live and to die. In that passage, and going on into that, you see kind of three things that run through Kierkegaard's work, the what am I to do, the decision. You get the desire that his will coheres to the divine will, like the purity of heart is to will one thing, comes up later. And then you get that the task of human is choosing to live knowing you're going to die, right? Not everyone lives before they die. And so like the what am I to do, the one thing, and death, they're all three in that passage. So knowing where we're going, are there threads there that we should start being attuned to, because we're going to get to read how this plays out. Like, you're right, so much of his future work you can see in these early reflections.
No, well, I mean, and those themes, right? Desire, do, and death are ultimately, the three D's that animate Kierkegaard's whole authorship. And it's important to realize that this is the kind of stuff that you and I and other Kierkegaard scholars, I mean, man, we could geek out about this for hours. And so we're just scratching the surface. But let me just sort of raise a couple of these things that then become big deals across Kierkegaard's authorship. One, so Kierkegaard suggests that finitude, the death part, is the condition for the doing part, right? Because ultimately, if I were infinite, I could do everything. There'd always be more time. So the fact that I have to make decisions in the face of the big question mark is precisely because my options are limited because of my finitude. But instead of seeing this then as some sort of lament over our finite existence, Kierkegaard sees this as actually the condition of meaning. It's like one of my Kierkegaard mentors taught me. His name was David Kangas, and right before he passed away, he got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, very, very, very young, died at only 52. And David sent an email where basically telling all his friends and family and people, I was on the email saying, hey, here's the situation. Here's what the doctors have said. Here's the condition, right? Here's the word. They've not given me a lot of time. So he lays this all out. And then he says, in the end, there is the unmanageable, but we would be trivial beings without it. So onward with my day, right? That haunts me as what a life well lived involves, right? Notice, we don't even have to know anything about what David did for a career, whether or not he had a family, what church he attended. The point is, all of those things become the content of the life well lived, which is the decision to say the unmanageable does not derail existence, it conditions it. So what then will I do? I'm going to get on with my day in light of a terminal cancer sentence. I'm going to get on with my day. And then he had an exclamation point. Right? Onward with my day, exclamation, like, so that idea of saying death conditions decision doesn't mean that we should then wring our hands and be all terrified by the fact that I might make a wrong decision. I might do it wrong. I might do it wrong. Recognize now decisions matter. Now they actually have substance. They really create opportunities for life. That's rock star, right? And it also, unfortunately, means that we can F it up. And that's where the desire comes in. Are my desires God's desires? Now, one of those complicated theological dimensions, and you and I probably would have slightly different takes on this, Tripp, because I tend to be right there on the relational theology side, but I tend to be a little bit more hesitant about, a particular process metaphysics. So does desiring what God's desire, does that mean then some sort of Calvinistic, idea that there is one path that is ordained for us and we can either choose to be on it or not? Does it mean more of an open theistic trajectory, which is what I hold to, that says God has lots of paths that might make sense for you, use your responsibility wisely, but align yourself with loving what God loves. Humble yourself to recognize that in relation to God, you're kind of a moron, and then realize how amazing it is and empowering it is that God shares the task of creation with you, right? Or does it become more processual in the sense of, look, there is no kind of path that God really has. It's that God loves. And so unify with love and then make a path, right? All these different options are plausible for Kierkegaard. And there are moments where, man, he sounds very hard-nosed on the providential direction, and it's up to us whether or not we do what God has called us into, but God's calling is specific. There are other passages where it seems to be, look, we see that in the Abraham story, right? Abraham, go kill your son, do this thing. This is the call. You can say no, but this is what I'm calling you to. But then there's other passages where Kierkegaard has much more of a, look, how will you then receive the love of God as an invitation to recognize that the world is this co-creative possibility for you, right? And I actually don't think that we've got to nail all that stuff down. I think we can read Kierkegaard and benefit from Kierkegaard as Calvinists and open theists and process theists and skeptical theists and atheists and across the board. So for anybody listening who's not even, doesn't identify as religious, well, what about this desire, what God desires? I would say there, well, are you trying to align your desire with some sense of what you take to be worthy of your worship, right? That can be a secular idea, right? Is your moral commitment something that is guiding your directionality? Or are you moving at odds with what you take to be the good, right? So this doesn't have to be a specific theological claim. That's what Kierkegaard scholars fight about, and I think we should. But for readers of Kierkegaard who are trying to say, but man, I'm 22 and trying to figure out what to do with my life, or I'm 40 and trying to figure out what to do with my life. I talk to CEOs all the time when I do business speaking who will reach out to me and say, I'm 55 and richer than I ever thought I would be, and I don't know why any of it matters. I was like, man, you sound like my 18-year-olds trying to pick a major. You just have fancier toys. So that's the Kierkegaard that speaks to us. As he says at the bottom of that same passage you just read, he basically says, what good would it do, right? If I knew all this stuff, if I discovered all this stuff, if I had all these truths, what good would it do for me, he says, if it had no deeper meaning for me and for my life? And a few lines down, he says, I certainly do not deny that I still accept an imperative of knowledge. In other words, he is not the irrationalist that he has been made to seem. He is not anti-reason. He is not saying, be gone with good thinking. He says, I expect the imperative knowledge. I accept it. It's important that we love truth and good arguments. And that through it, people may be influenced, right? People should be moved by good reasons, especially in a time of rampant conspiracy theory, Trumpism, and disastrous realities in America. Like, we should listen to good reasons, but, all important but, then it must come alive in me. So what good does it do to have all these arguments, have all these reasons, to know what the batter should be doing or how to hit the curveball if it's not coming alive in you? Either as coach, maybe you're not the one going to swing, but are you coaching the person who is? Are you teaching them how to do the thing and navigate it more effectively? Maybe it is you. Are you willing to pick up a bat and walk onto the surface of the field, right? If we aren't willing to do that, living life as a, couch quarterback, you're right. We come to the end of our life and realize we've never lived, to quote Thoreau again, right? What a life of desperation. But man, if we like that Kirk Franklin song, he says, he's got this great song where he's basically, the whole thing is like, I want to live before I die. I've got to live before I die. And then at the very end, the last line, he flips it and he says, in order to live before I die, I've got to die before I live. In other words, I have to die to self. I've got to die to that sense of certainty. I've got to be willing to recognize the they benefit and are empowered by my sense of their correctness and my unwillingness to raise questions, to raise the question. That reality is made possible by our dying. And it sucks, right? But then we can be like Seneca, who says, hey, you wish you had more life. We all do. But at the end of the day, if you had 1,000 years, it would change nothing essential. Nothing. Because you'd still have a limited amount of time to do something that you thought needed done. And most of us would fail to do it because we simply lived lives handed to us by others that never actually cultivated in us a purposive intention to be what we want to become.
Okay, so now I'm gonna maybe only pick, well, I have some little questions, but I think it'd be real helpful to lay out what the section where he decides to study theology, right?
Yes, he's now in. Yep.
Right. That passage I think is helpful because it brings up how the they, right? Like no one picks where they're born in the world, and just a whole part of growing up is learning the stories and the rituals and the way in which you learn language means that the whole world you relate to comes interpreted. You never deal with just reality. It's always reality as mediated through the symbolic social knowledge of your community. And that's where the they comes from, right? The they is like everybody and nobody at the same time.
That's right. That's right.
And so there he then shows how the theology in one sense is a they. He uses in Christianity itself, there are contradictions so great that they prevent an unobscured view to a considerable extent. At any rate, as you know, I grew up in orthodoxy, so to speak, but from the moment I began to think for myself, the gigantic colossus began to totter. And he goes on describing it, and and he gets at the end and joking about the whole tradition just comes across like one giant clump of this is true, and it's more or less fine for me, I guess. And then there's rationalism. At the end, he goes, the fallacy is that when they're in agreement with Scripture, they use it as a basis, but otherwise not. Thus, they adopt mutually exclusive points of view. And for those that haven't done the reading yet, read it, because it sounds like you're talking to someone who realizes something was getting itself done in the tradition that was handed on. I'm fascinated. I'm going to study it. But also, there's some really strange contradictions. And a lot of people just go, well, I used reason, or the Bible says so. Horrible conversation stoppers. They aren't getting at what's going on. Thinking of how, in some sense, his vocation as an author was giving steroids to his deconstructive impulses in adolescence. How would you describe that for him, and how you see this passage opening up to where we'll get to at the end?
Yeah. So, as I said, Kierkegaard's whole task in his authorship was, what does it mean to become a Christian, to bring Christianity back to Christendom? And here we see the early moments of him kind of owning that call, right? It's him realizing being a Christian can't just be for him, this fortunate few who have it all figured out, who just get up and give the sermon and the Bible says, and on we go, right? But nor can it be the others who are so tossed, by the winds of change that they don't actually know what they're talking about. He's like, again, it's neither of those extremes. It's this recognition of the question that continues. And we see him say, part of why he's now moving into theology, and he admits this. He says, page 7, I also know that this way I can make Father very happy, right? So he's not unaware of a they, and a very concrete one. Dad will be happy if I study theology, if I look like I'm going into the ministry, if that's what's going on, he'll be happy. Some things will be easier. But the reason he's going into it is because he basically says, look, there's something here that grabs me. And the something that grabs me is also something that it seems like everyone is going out of their way to smooth over, right? But notice, if it's perfectly smooth, there's no traction, there's no grab, there's no grip. right? And, you know, I'm going mountain biking later today. If you go mountain biking with really bad tires, you're going to hurt yourself. It's only because you've got those edges that grab the dirt and grab the terrain that it can gain traction, what Wittgenstein calls the rough ground, right? So Kierkegaard pointing out these great difficulties, the giant colossus falling, is an invitation, as you said, to give in to the deconstructive impulse, which is D, as Derrida says, construction. It's not about tearing it down and, you know, doing a jig or a saunter on the ashes, right? It's about letting it crack so we can actually see where it needs reinforced, what actually needs built with these blocks that have fallen from it. And that's ultimately what Kierkegaard's task is to say, not down with Christianity because it's a rationalistic mess, right? He's not saying out with the Bible because people use it as a battering ram for their own interpretations. He's not suggesting that, you know, burn all the churches because they're just centers of idolatry. It's by going to the church, not a mile from his house, every single time he could, that he comes to realize the invitation table of Christ is bigger than it has been expressed in the church. It's by reading scripture so carefully and writing the edifying and upbuilding discourses, reflecting on scripture, that he comes to see a kind of what we would call biblical literalism is a deadening thing, right? It kills Christianity rather than animates it. So it's not because he abandons the Bible or Jesus or the church. It's because he recognizes that the Bible has become a defense mechanism for people who use Jesus to reinforce their church status and power as a social manifestation of their dignity. And Kierkegaard wants nothing to do with that. Mm-hmm. And this is why he even says, where is it? Page 8 to 9. This is what I need to live a completely human life and not merely one of knowledge. So I could base the development of my thought not on something called objective, right? Like the Bible, the church, this name of Jesus, even though, again, he's appealing to all of them. Or it's reason. Something that in any case is not my own. Back to this idea that the Bible is a story of relational engagement with who God is, right? Mm-hmm. But upon something that is bound up with the deepest roots of my existence, through which I am, so to speak, grafted into the divine, to which I cling fast, even though the whole world may collapse. This is what I need, and this is what I strive for. Wow, right? Part of the claim here is not, because of what we would call hermeneutic indeterminacy and perspectival epistemology that attend reading scripture and going to church, right? It's always someone's Jesus that you're getting taught. Kierkegaard's not saying, oh, well, then, I can't find Jesus anywhere. Oh, to hell with this. What he says is, no, that's why I've got to recognize I'm not letting who Jesus is for me be exhausted in who they have made Jesus into. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's not meaning he'll get back to some sort of pure, authentic thing that is interpretation free. Instead, it's an invitation to be invested in this task of striving. And notice how that pairs now with what we started, the passage you took us to. There are others who let themselves be influenced so completely that it never becomes clear to them what direction they are really striving. And now he says, this is what I strive for. Namely, the recognition that direction is complicated because everyone tells you that you're already there. You have to be able to move, and that requires that we don't have it all figured out. So this is an argument for what I would describe as epistemic humility that runs throughout Kierkegaard's authorship. It's what makes Abraham find faith in fear and trembling, not in confidence and certainty and, disregard, right? Mm-hmm. Faith is a risky thing. Life is a terrifying thing, but it's also, next line, I find joy and refreshment in contemplating the great men who have found that precious stone for which they sell all. This is also what makes joy possible. Works of love, practicing Christianity, these are books that we will talk about, and they're not books that say, oh, well, do this or you're going to hell. What it says is, love others because this is what love looks like animated as a life. Mm-hmm. Right? This invites us to care about living. And Kierkegaard does that at 22 years old. And he recognizes the last little journal entry, it's just one paragraph on page 12, where he says, philosophy is perfectly right in saying life must be understood backward, but then one forgets the other clause. It must be lived forward. The more one thinks through this clause, the more one concludes that life and temporality never becomes properly understandable, simply because never at any time does one get perfect repose to take a stance backward. You don't get perfect repose. Why? Because you're living, right? You can't get outside existence to reflect on existence. Only existing people think about existence. Mm-hmm. Only living things reflect and articulate what it means to be alive. And so this is such a cool idea because we get the decision. We also get the desire. Well, I'm moving somewhere. Mm-hmm. And we get the death, right? Because we don't have perfect repose. We don't get to step outside of our context. We only get to do the best we can where we are with what we got. And that's what living has always been about.
You know that there's a high quality dodgeball reference with death, desire, and decision. You're like, wow, you got the 4 Ds.
Duck, dodge, duck.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I think that's right. You and I have the shared thorn in our side of having grown up in churches where alliteration counted as theological sophistication.
Are you saying that's not the case? Oh,
I'm sorry to let you know. It turns out, big points can be made without alliteration. But it's true. Kierkegaard, I guess the thing that I would encourage people to take away from these early journal entries is, you can hear people say, right, why would I want to learn about how to live from a 22-year-old? He's never lived. And yet, again, maybe think about that passage. Unless we become like little children, we'll have no participation in the kingdom of heaven. Because what is it little kids do? They, thinking back to Thoreau, they go for walks where everything is magic, but they also go for walks and recognize the danger, right? Mm-hmm. In ways that then we get old and we become, jaded. So we either don't go for walks, or when we go, we make sure that we make them so safe as to not actually really challenge or real create problems because, I got to get back and pay that mortgage. And Kierkegaard's saying, look, whether you're sitting at home or on the trail, the task is to become like the kid who can recognize all this stuff is joy-inducing and anxiety-producing, mm-hmm. Right? You don't get away from the one because of the other.
Yeah.
Just because yesterday I took my son to get a milkshake, and man, a milkshake was good. And before we got the milkshake, we ate Popeye's chicken because he had never had Popeyes. And I was like, dude, we're going to go get some Popeye's chicken. So we ate Popeye's chicken nuggets and it was lovely. And then we went next door and got a milkshake and he's like, Dad, this is the perfect day. And of course, it's so funny because what he saw as the perfect day, I see as also cholesterol inducing, heart attack causing, diabetes reality, right? So somehow his ability to see this as the best thing ever is that he's living forward without the backward understanding. Mm-hmm. And so part of what I think Kierkegaard is doing is recognizing we get the understanding backwards as we grow. We get good at that. We get good at risk calculation. We get good at planning for the future. We get good at checking the boxes of our success narratives. And we get good at then narrating others as non-successful and drags and pulls on our economy or in our way or problems, right? We're good at adult egoistic living.
Mhm.
But then he says we forget that we've got to keep living forward, which wrecks us, which humbles us, which makes us hospitable to a stranger we cannot predict. And in doing those things, we should not simply be destroyed by the fear and anxiety. We should also recognize that, you know what, that milkshake rocks.
Mhm.
And joy is possible even in the midst of the waves and the storms. And Kierkegaard's whole authorship is effectively devoted to that fact, right? As he says somewhere, actually repeatedly, that though we are suspended above 70,000 fathoms, there we find faith. Right? We don't find faith. It's interesting, right? We don't find faith on the rock or with the, inner tube that comes floating by. It's not like in Titanic, oh, get on top of the board and now you will live. Faith is found above the fathoms.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think Kierkegaard says, yeah, and let's avoid drowning by swimming straight down. Right? And that's what living forwards is all about. Mm-hmm. So 22-year-old has a lot to teach us, not because he's got it figured out, but because he's willing to be honest about the fact that he doesn't. And yet he's also got the courage to be invested in the importance of living in that direction. Mm-hmm. And as far as I'm concerned, at 44, yeah, I'm down to travel with that guy. I'm happy to go for a walk with him.
Awesome. Well, we'll wrap up this session. I had a stack of questions around his description of science and epistemologies of engagement versus epistemologies of difference. I'm sure I'll come up with a way to make that show back up. Also, at some point, want to address whether the critiques of him as a fideist are true or not, because it seems like he's not cooperating with sweeping generalizations. My analytic philosopher friends like to use him as a caricature in opening epistemology lectures, but that and more will have to come next week. But any words of wisdom for reading either or, especially if people have never read someone who is like, taking the activity of indirect communication using a pseudonym. Like if this is your first time doing it, what happens when they start underlining things because they really don't like it or like it too much, knowing what he's doing?
Yeah, no, it's such a good point. I once had a friend who had read The Seducer's Diary, which is in either or, and he said, yeah, I read some Kierkegaard. He was such a misogynist. I never read anything else by him. I don't have room in my life for that. And I was like, yeah, but that wasn't Kierkegaard. And he was like, well, of course it is. I said Kierkegaard at the front of the cup. I had to explain to him all of this complication. So reading Either Or is the first book I ever read by Kierkegaard. And it is hard because there's so much going on and there's so many voices. But again, the way I would encourage people is to try this on. Whatever you're reading for next week, read it with, so what if I lived in the world in a way that made this the things I would say, right? Because if you do that, then now what you're doing is precisely what Kierkegaard is trying. He writes in a mode of what he calls indirect communication when he's writing as a pseudonym, and direct communication when he writes under his own name. And the difference is simply this. Indirect communication, he says, gives a dialectical knot that the reader has to untie for themselves, right? He's encouraging selfhood as a praxis of reading. Direct communication gives his take on how we should read. So it's not inviting the emergence of selfhood, it's speaking to selves wanting to move in a direction of Christian truth. So next week, we are getting an invitation to us to become selves. And it is presented by basically this editor named Victor Eremita, or Victor the Hermit, who it's really like puts together all these different texts, and there's at least two authors inside of Eremita, the editing work. The first is A, there's somebody referred to as A, who represents the aesthetic mode of living, this immediacy of external willing and then obtaining that external object and then moving forward in light of it. Any of us I'm not one, but anybody who gets real excited because the new iPhone comes out in whatever months and already has their standing order, anybody who's a big fan of leasing cars because then you always drive a new one, anybody who switches majors every 3 months because, hey, you're just bored with the other one, you then will find yourself agreeing with A. Because what he's doing is showing that mode of life, that your identity is found in external achievement, external accomplishment. And then you are bored, and so you need another. Serial entrepreneurs will like A. But then we see this other person named the Judge, Judge William. And he represents the ethical. And the ethical mode is a mode that is this Hegelian idea of trying to find social status by being a role in society rather than an individual in a role. And this is where he's going to really stress the importance of marriage, because what does marriage do? It takes you from an individual to becoming a husband or a wife or a partner. Like, it makes you a thing that society now can license and support as a social fact. And that's the thing we see. And who describes that? A judge, a civic officer. So who describes the aesthetic life? An initial, right? The artist formerly known as A or something. Like, it's radically anonymous precisely because you find yourself in all these anonymous one-night encounters, one-day encounters. The judge is stable and firm and named because he's able to then say it's about finding our ethical place in the social order. And yet Kierkegaard is inviting us to try these ideas on, not just and say, hey, what if this is true? But what if I were the person for whom this is true? And my hunch is all of us, no matter who we are, how old we are, what our career is, there will be moments in the aesthetic mode that we find ourselves seeing ourselves. And there will be moments in the ethical mode where we find ourselves seeing ourselves. And yet Kierkegaard doesn't want to say a pox on both their houses, they're all wrong. What he does want to say is, unless we become self-reflective, both of these modes of living lead to despair. And they lead to despair because ultimately they do not allow you to become authentically invested in the task of becoming. Aesthetically, we discharge it onto the external objects, right? We get our identity by the car we drive, by our bank account, by our fancy phone or clothes. 2, ethical, we get our identity from the social role, the social status, the power structure, the universality of our moral life. That then names us as good. In both cases, we are avoiding the risky realities of decision. And we are trying to evade through transformation and change, aesthetic, or through stability and objectivity, we're trying to evade the realities of finitude. So it's a cool book. I think, again, it's one of those where everything we've talked about today we'll see again there, but it can be hard to read because it's not Kierkegaard offering a thesis. It's a bunch of weird stuff from first personal investments in these different ways of living. And Kierkegaard's inviting us to do that same self-reflective, personally invested sort of work ourselves.
Yeah. So remember, everyone who's joined us, you can respond to any of the emails with questions, be it about the reading or, elements of it we didn't get to, or just other topics in general for, processing in a general Kierkegaardian tone. I hope you all enjoyed session 1. If you got a nerdy friend, feel free to invite them to join the fun. And with that, we'll tell you goodbye and see you next week.
See you guys next week.